Sign the papers, Sarah. You are getting nothing.
If that is what you want. Actually, sir, her net worth just tripled yours. Meet your new trillionaire boss.
Nathan Holloway slid the divorce papers across the polished conference table with a smirk that hadn't left his face all morning. You know what your problem is, Vivian? He leaned back in his chair, cufflinks catching the light. You never had ambition. 7 years, and you were content just existing in the background of my life. He tapped the signature line with one finger. Sign it. Take what I'm offering and go back to being nobody. That's what you were before me, and that's what you'll be after. Vivian Sterling picked up the pen without a word and signed her name. Dima, if this story already has your attention, hit that like button, drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and stay with me all the way to the end. Because what Nathan Holloway never understood is that the woman he just dismissed with a smirk was carrying a secret that would quietly dismantle everything he thought he had built. This is the story of what happens when a man mistakes silence for surrender. The conference room on the 14th floor of Decker and Lowe Legal Services smelled like recycled air and expensive cologne. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of gray New York morning where the sky couldn't decide whether to rain or just threaten to, and Nathan Holloway had arrived 17 minutes early for his own divorce proceedings because he wanted Vivian to walk in and find him already comfortable, already in control. He'd worn the charcoal suit, the one Vivian had helped him pick out 3 years ago at a little tailor on West 57th, back when they still did things like shop together on Saturday afternoons. He hadn't thought about that until he was already in the elevator, and by then it didn't matter enough to go home and change. Vivian arrived exactly on time. She looked smaller than he remembered, which didn't make sense because they'd had dinner together 6 days ago, a stiff and silent meal that their mediator had strongly encouraged as a gesture toward cooperative dissolution. But something about the formal setting made her seem diminished. She was wearing a plain navy blazer over a cream blouse, her dark hair pulled back the way she wore it when she had somewhere professional to be. She carried a single manila folder. No lawyer. Nathan had 2. Vivian? He nodded, not standing. Nathan. She sat down across from him, placed the folder on the table, and folded her hands on top of it. His late attorney, a sharp-shouldered woman named Carla Britton, slid the settlement package across the table. It was 41 pages. Nathan had read roughly the first 4 and trusted Carla with the rest. It's straightforward, Carla said. Mr. Holloway retains the Midtown apartment, the Berkshire property, full ownership of Holloway Venture Capital, and the investment portfolio in joint names. Mrs. Holloway receives the agreed-upon settlement figure of $240,000, the vehicle registered in her name, and personal effects. Vivian's attorney, a quiet man named Gerald Park, whom she'd hired 2 weeks ago, reviewed the pages methodically. He asked 3 small clarifying questions. Carla answered them without looking up from her notes. Vivian didn't say anything for a long time. She looked at the document the way she looked at most things, steadily, without visible emotion, like she was reading a lease agreement for an apartment she'd already decided not to take. This looks fine, she said finally. Nathan had expected, he didn't know. Something. A negotiation at minimum. Maybe tears. She'd cried once in mediation 6 weeks ago, a single moment that had made him feel both guilty and vaguely validated at the same time. Today there was nothing like that. You're sure? Gerald Park asked her quietly. We discussed the possibility of a more detailed evaluation of the venture capital holdings. I'm sure. She didn't look at her attorney when she said it. She was looking at the window. The gray sky, the building stacked behind glass. Nathan watched her from across the table and felt, for just a moment, something he didn't have a name for, like a wrong note in a song he knew by heart. Then it passed. He leaned forward. It's the right call, Vivian. Honestly, you were never interested in any of that. The business, the investments, that was always my world. She looked at him then. It was the kind of look that didn't contain enough to argue with. No sharpness, no hurt, no heat. Just a flat, clear assessment that lasted about 2 seconds before she turned back to the documents. You contributed nothing to Holloway Capital, Nathan continued. He hadn't planned to keep talking, but the silence in the room was doing something uncomfortable to him. I want you to know I'm not saying that to be cruel. It's just a fact. You were supportive. That counts for something, but the settlement is more than fair given your actual involvement. Gerald Park looked up. Carla Britton put her pen down. Vivian said, Nathan? What? I wasn't asking for more. A beat of silence. I know, he said. I just wanted to make sure you understood. I understand everything about this document. She picked up the pen from the table, a plain ballpoint, not the engraved one Nathan had brought specifically for the occasion, and signed her name on the indicated lines, neat, unhurried, the way she did most things. She pushed the pages back across the table and stood. I hope the apartment treats you well, she said. Not meanly, not warmly, just said it the way a person says something they actually mean without any performance attached. Then she picked up her manila folder, nodded once to Gerald Park, and walked out of the room. Nathan watched the door close behind her. That's that, Carla said, gathering papers. Nathan nodded. That's that. He stayed in his chair for another few minutes after everyone else had begun packing up, looking at the empty seat where Vivian had been sitting. The manila folder was gone. He realized he'd never found out what was in it. He decided it didn't matter. The story Nathan told himself about his marriage and its ending was a clean one. He had met Vivian Sterling at a fundraiser 8 years ago, introduced through a mutual acquaintance at one of those midtown cocktail parties where everyone is dressed expensively and networking aggressively. She had been standing near the bar, looking at a painting on the wall, really looking at it, not performing interest like everyone else in the room, and he'd found that attractive, unusual. She was beautiful in a composed way that didn't announce itself, dark-eyed and attentive and quieter than anyone else he'd spoken to that evening. He'd pursued her. She hadn't made it easy, which he'd also found attractive. They dated for 14 months before he proposed, married in a small ceremony in Connecticut, and moved together into the apartment on 63rd Street that Nathan had owned for 2 years prior. What Nathan told himself now, at 43, looking back at those 7 years of marriage with the clarity he believed only distance could provide, was this. Vivian had been a good wife in the ways that were visible and a disappointment in the ways that mattered. She was organized and calm and had excellent taste and made his home look like the home of a man who had things together. But she had never built anything, never wanted anything of her own badly enough to go get it. She had worked part-time for a nonprofit foundation in her 30s, something to do with arts education for underserved kids, but she'd never pushed for more, never climbed, never competed. He had spent 7 years being quietly frustrated by that, by the sense that he was reaching and she was watching, that he was building and she was simply there. She's sweet, his friend Darren had said once, a few years into the marriage, in a tone that communicated everything Darren was too polite to say directly. Nathan hadn't pushed back on that, because at the time he'd kind of agreed. The relationship with Vanessa Cole had begun 14 months before the divorce, which Nathan didn't dwell on in any version of the story he told himself or others. Vanessa was 36, a senior acquisitions partner at a private equity firm, sharp and fast-moving and openly ambitious in ways that Nathan had found, at first, exciting and then progressively confirming. She was everything he'd convinced himself he'd been missing. She wore her goals like clothing. She talked about money and strategy and leveraged the way other people talked about the weather, fluently and constantly and with genuine interest. She had told him early on, you need someone who can run alongside you, not someone you have to drag. He had thought about Vivian when she said that, and he had not defended his wife. By the time the divorce papers were signed and the mediations concluded and the 30-day waiting period elapsed, Nathan Holloway moved Vanessa into the 63rd Street apartment with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had made a correct and overdue decision. He donated 2 of Vivian's remaining items, a lamp and a small decorative mirror she'd apparently forgotten, to the building's free exchange shelf in the lobby without calling to ask if she wanted them. He did not feel bad about that. He was moving forward. That was what forward-moving people did. Vivian's new apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Astoria, that smelled like the lamb and herbs cooking from the Greek restaurant on the ground floor. It was 560 square feet. The elevator was broken roughly every third week. The radiator knocked. She had signed the lease the same day she'd left the mediator's office the first time, 3 months before the divorce was finalized, because she'd known long before the process started how she wanted to come out of it, cleanly, without anything that would require ongoing negotiation or entanglement or the particular exhaustion of watching Nathan's face while lawyers argued over values she already knew didn't matter to her. $240,000. The car, her clothes, her books, the collection of small ceramics she'd built over a decade, and a box of documents Gerald Park had helped her gather quietly over the preceding 4 months. She had taken nothing else. She hadn't wanted anything else. The apartment was small in ways that required adjustment. She was used to ceilings that didn't feel close. She was used to closets that were actually closets. The bathroom had a slow drain, and the kitchen window faced a brick wall, and the upstairs neighbor apparently exercised every morning at 6 with the enthusiasm of someone training for something significant. She found she didn't mind. There was something clarifying about a space that only contained what you'd chosen to put in it, about a morning where nobody needed her to be anything in particular. She drank her coffee standing at the kitchen window and looked at the brick wall and felt, underneath the obvious grief and strangeness of starting over, a quiet that she hadn't experienced in longer than she could accurately measure. She was sad. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. 7 years was 7 years, and she had loved Nathan, or at least she had loved the person she'd believed he was when she said yes to him. The marriage had been a slow erosion, not dramatic, no single terrible event, just a long, gradual process of her shrinking and him not noticing, or noticing and deciding it was acceptable. She had spent years trying to be useful in ways he could see and valued. She had managed his home, managed his social calendar, maintained friendships with people who were his business contacts, attended events she found tedious because they mattered to his network, and she had worked quietly, steadily for the foundation. Children's arts education, after-school programs in 4 boroughs. She had written grant applications and managed program directors and visited schools and sat on evaluation panels. She had been good at it. She had found, in that work, the version of herself that Nathan never seemed interested in. He had called it her little thing, once. To someone else, at a party, not thinking she could hear him from the kitchen. She had finished plating the appetizers and carried them out and smiled at his colleague and thought, I'm going to remember that. She didn't have a plan. That was the thing people would later get wrong when the story became a story. They'd imagine a scheme, a long game, a carefully assembled revenge. But Vivian didn't work that way. She had simply made a decision to stop folding herself into a shape that fit Nathan's life, to stop waiting for him to see the person she actually was. She had told her mother she was getting divorced over the phone on a Tuesday, very briefly. Her mother had said little. They had never been close in the way that produced useful conversation during hard moments. She had told her friend Camille in person, over bad Thai food in Camille's living room, and cried properly then, the full version, the one that had been waiting for months, and Camille had sat with her through it and said the right things and wrong things in the proportions that real people produce, and it helped. And then Vivian got up and went back to her small apartment and continued being alive, which is what you do. Go on. The call came on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. She was reading at her kitchen table with her second cup of coffee when her phone rang. Unknown number, but a New York area code. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her pick up. Is this Vivian Sterling? A man's voice. Older, measured, formal, without being stiff. It is. Miss Sterling, my name is Richard Aldrin. I'm a fiduciary attorney at Aldrin, Page & Morris. I've been trying to reach you for several weeks through addresses that appear to have been out of date. I'm very glad to have found you. She put down her cup. What is this regarding? It's regarding the Sterling Family Trust, he said, specifically the formal activation of your designation as sole beneficiary and controlling authority. Ms. Sterling, a condition of this trust was fulfilled upon your divorce decree. I am calling because you are now, legally and formally, the chair and sole beneficiary of the Sterling Continuum. Vivian was quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure I'd ever make this call. Richard Aldrin said, not unkindly. I've been administering this trust for 11 years. I was appointed by your grandmother's estate. She was quite specific about the conditions. My grandmother, Vivian said. Eleanor Constance Sterling. Yes. Vivian stood up from the table. She walked to the kitchen window, looked at the brick wall, looked at nothing in particular. She was 38 years old. Her grandmother had died when she was 27, a quiet death in a Connecticut house that had smelled like cedar and old books. They had not been expressive people, the Sterlings. Vivian had grieved privately and moved on. She had known, in a vague way, that there was a trust. There had been a letter after Eleanor's death, delivered by a notary, which informed her that she was a named beneficiary of a family trust to be activated at such time as she fulfilled the designated conditions. The letter had not specified the conditions explicitly. Vivian had been 27. She had not been wealthy. She had not lived in a way that made her think often about inheritance or trust law. She had put the letter in her document box and eventually stopped thinking about it. How large is it? She asked. The trust? A brief pause. Not a hesitant pause. A considered one. The Sterling Continuum manages assets of approximately $4.3 billion, Richard Aldrin said, primarily long-term philanthropic and impact investment vehicles. There are also endowment positions in 11 institutions, several of which you may know by name. The full picture is something I would prefer to walk you through in person, if you're willing. Vivian sat back down at her kitchen table. She looked at her coffee cup. She looked at her hands. I can meet you Friday, she said. Her voice was even. I'm available any time Friday, he said. Thank you, Ms. Sterling. And, for what it's worth, from someone who knew your grandmother's intentions quite well, I think she would have been very glad about this phone call. Vivian thanked him and ended the call. She sat in her small kitchen with the smell of the Greek restaurant drifting up from below and the distant sound of her upstairs neighbor apparently finishing up a workout, and she held very still for a long time. $4.3 billion. Her grandmother's voice came back to her unbidden. Not a specific thing Eleanor had ever said, just the quality of it, low and direct and without apology. Eleanor Sterling had built something, that much Vivian knew. Had built it so carefully and so quietly that most people in New York's financial world didn't know her name. Had built it and then built a test around it. A test that asked a single question, in the end, though it hadn't looked like a question at the time. Who are you when no one is rewarding you for it? Vivian pressed her palms flat against the table. She thought about the conference room, the divorce papers, Nathan's smirk and his cufflinks and his careful speech about her contributions, delivered to an audience of attorneys, meant to make her feel small enough to take $240,000 and stop being inconvenient. She had not felt small. She thought about that now, and something moved through her, not triumph, not vindication, but something quieter and more solid than either. A kind of recognition. Her grandmother had been watching, in the way that dead people sometimes watch, which is to say through the conditions they leave behind, and apparently she had passed. She met Richard Aldrin on Friday at an office on Park Avenue that occupied the top 2 floors of a building that didn't advertise its tenants. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired, with the precise manners of someone who had spent decades in rooms where precision mattered. He shook her hand and offered her coffee and set a binder on the table between them that was 2 inches thick. They spent 4 hours together. Richard walked her through the trust structure, the institutional holdings, the foundation's operating history, the team of 16 who had been quietly stewarding the continuum for the 11 years since Eleanor's death. He explained the conditions of her grandmother's trust. Not the legalese, but the intent behind it, which he had thought about carefully over many years. Eleanor was specific, he said. The beneficiary had to prove the ability to make a significant sacrifice, to walk away from material security without it breaking her. She believed that wealth in the hands of someone who couldn't demonstrate that capacity would be wealth poorly placed. Vivian turned a page in the binder, a list of organizations, names she recognized, names she'd seen on buildings and programs and annual reports over the years. She had worked alongside some of these institutions without knowing they'd been seeded by money that was, technically, waiting for her. Why didn't she tell me? Vivian asked. Not accusatory. just genuinely curious. Richard was quiet for a moment. She told me, when I took over the trust, that telling you would ruin it, that the point wasn't what you did with the information. It was what you did without it. He paused. She said you were the one worth watching. She said she knew from the time you were about 11. Vivian put the binder down. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it today. He pulled a single sheet from a folder to his left. There are some decisions we'll need to begin discussing. Structure, operating priorities, your public or private posture as chair. But none of that is urgent. We've been patient for 11 years. We can afford a few more weeks. She looked at the sheet. At the top, in plain serif font, Sterling Continuum, active as of November 2nd, 2024, the date of her divorce decree. She planned this, Vivian said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. She planned everything, Richard said, with something that might have been admiration. Vivian folded her hands on top of the binder the way she'd folded them on her manila folder in the conference room 3 weeks ago. That same room. That same gray light through the window. Nathan across the table telling her she had contributed nothing. She thought of the pen she'd used to sign the papers. A plain ballpoint. The engraved one he'd brought had still been sitting uncapped on his side of the table when she left. She had not felt small. She had known, even then, though she hadn't known the full shape of it, that she was walking toward something, that the signing of those papers was not an ending she needed to survive. It was a door opening. She just hadn't known yet what was on the other side. All right, she said, let's talk about what comes next. Richard Aldrin picked up his pen and, for the first time in the conversation, allowed himself a small smile. I've been waiting 11 years to have this conversation, he said. I'm glad it's finally you I'm having it with. Outside, New York moved the way it always did, loudly, without reference to anyone's private reversals, indifferent and alive. Somewhere across the city, Nathan Holloway was having a working lunch with a prospective investor, telling the story of his forward momentum, his upgraded life, his excellent judgment. And Vivian Sterling turned to the first page of a binder that held the full history of something her grandmother had built across a lifetime of quiet, deliberate work, and began to read. Richard Aldrin had a habit of arriving to meetings before his clients, which meant that on the second Friday in November, when Vivian came back to the Park Avenue office with a yellow legal pad and a list of 11 questions she'd written over the previous week, he was already there, coffee poured, a second binder on the table that was even thicker than the first. You read everything, he said. It wasn't a question. I read everything. She sat down, put the legal pad on the table, uncapped her pen. I have questions. I expected you would. The questions took 2.5 hours. Vivian had grown up in a house where money was present but not discussed, where the Sterling name meant something she had never been given a full explanation for, where her grandmother moved through rooms with the contained authority of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove herself to anyone. What Vivian had not grown up with was any detailed understanding of what Eleanor had actually built. The Continuum had operated in deep institutional privacy for 4 decades. No press releases, no profile pieces, no attendance at the galas and charity dinners where New York's philanthropic class usually made itself visible. Its name appeared in the footnotes of annual reports from universities and arts organizations and policy institutes and medical research centers, always modestly, always without elaboration. She actively avoided attention? Vivian asked at one point. She found it counterproductive, Richard said. Her view was that the work spoke, or it didn't, and that public positioning was mostly about ego management. She had very little patience for ego management. Vivian wrote something on her legal pad. That sounds like her. It was completely her. By the end of the second meeting, Vivian had a clearer picture of what she had inherited, not just in financial terms, though those continued to feel surreal every time the numbers appeared on a printed page, but in structural and human terms. The Sterling Continuum had 16 full-time staff, a portfolio of active grants across 23 organizations, 4 endowment positions at universities, and 2 long-running impact investment vehicles in affordable housing and workforce education. It had operating protocols, a legal framework, a set of institutional relationships maintained carefully over decades. It was not a dormant pile of money waiting to be activated. It was a functioning organization that had been running on administrative autopilot for 11 years, waiting for its designated chair. What it didn't have was direction. Eleanor had built the infrastructure but had not predetermined Vivian's vision. That, apparently, was another part of the test. Not just whether Vivian could survive loss, but whether she had something of her own to say about what came next. Vivian drove back to Astoria that evening in the Honda Civic that was now, per the divorce settlement, entirely hers. She sat in traffic on the 59th Street Bridge and looked at the city laid out below and around her and thought about her grandmother in the careful, fragmentary way she usually thought about her. Moments more than impressions, specific details rather than broad portraits. Eleanor at 81, in the Connecticut house, sitting very upright in the green armchair she'd had reupholstered twice. Vivian at 16, visiting for a long weekend, uncomfortable in the way teenagers are uncomfortable in the homes of elderly relatives where the pace is wrong and the silences feel weighted. Eleanor had found her in the library on the second afternoon, pulling books off the shelves without any particular agenda, and had said, "What are you looking for?" "I don't know," Vivian had said. "That's actually fine," Eleanor had said. "Most people spend their whole lives looking for something they couldn't describe. The ones who are honest about it are generally more interesting than the ones who pretend they have a precise destination." She had gone back to her own book without elaboration. Vivian had taken a biography of a woman she'd never heard of off the shelf and sat down and read 60 pages of it before dinner. She had never told Nathan that story. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't a secret. It was just hers, and something she had kept hers because it had felt, in the later years of the marriage, like the only act of self-preservation available to her. She pulled off the bridge and navigated the familiar Queens streets back to her building and climbed 4 flights to her apartment and sat on the floor with her back against the couch. She hadn't bought a new couch yet. There were still boxes she hadn't fully unpacked, and held her legal pad in her lap and looked at the ceiling. $4.3 billion and a staff of 16 and 23 active grantees, and the question, what do you want to build? She didn't have the answer yet. But for the first time in a long time, she was sitting with a question that was entirely and unarguably hers to answer. That felt like something worth protecting. Nathan, meanwhile, had told the story of his divorce to enough people that it had smoothed itself out into something close to a polished anecdote. The version he told at the working lunch with Douglas Merritt, a prospective LP for Holloway Capital's third fund, was the most refined iteration yet. 7 years is a long time to figure out you've grown in different directions, he said, with the measured regret of a man who had processed his feelings responsibly. She's a good person. We just wanted different things. Merritt nodded with the sympathy of a man who had his own complicated marital history and didn't want to examine it too closely. These things happen, Merritt said. They do. Nathan flagged the server for another round. Honestly, it's clarifying. New chapter. Vanessa was the new chapter, and he made sure people knew it without making it look like he was trying to make sure people knew it. She attended the right dinners. She was visibly impressive in the ways that his professional world valued. Direct, well-informed, quick with a relevant insight at the right moment. When Nathan introduced her at events, he could see people recalibrate their assessment of him slightly upward, and he found that gratifying in a way he didn't spend too much time examining. "She's remarkable," said his colleague, Trent Bayfield, at an industry event in early December. "Where'd you two meet?" "Friends in common," Nathan said, which was technically true if you stretched the word friends. He didn't think often about Vivian. He had a system for not thinking about things that were finished, a clean pivot, a forward focus, a deliberate redirection of attention toward the next thing. It had served him well in business, and he applied it to his personal life with the same discipline. Occasionally, in the margins of unguarded moments, in the shower and the 40 seconds between laying down and falling asleep, something would surface. Not regret exactly. More like an unresolved equation. The way she'd looked at him in the conference room with that flat, clear assessment. The manila folder she'd carried in and carried out. The fact that she hadn't negotiated. He knew people who'd been through divorces where the negotiation was brutal, protracted, expensive, in ways that left scars on both sides. His friend Paul had spent 14 months in litigation over a brownstone. His college roommate's divorce had produced a custody arrangement that still, 8 years later, required monthly meetings with a mediator. Vivian had taken $240,000 and left. He had assumed this was because she had no leverage, had no interest in leverage, was constitutionally uninterested in fighting for things. He still assumed that, but sometimes the flat, clear look came back to him at inconvenient moments. He stopped thinking about it. He was very good at stopping thinking about things. Camille Fortier had known Vivian since graduate school, which was long enough to have a fairly accurate model of her in her head, and so when Vivian called in late November and said, very calmly, that she had something to tell her, Camille prepared herself for something either very good or very strange. It turned out to be both. They met at a coffee shop in the West Village on a Saturday morning, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and good espresso and the particular weekend hum of people who have nowhere urgent to be. Vivian arrived in jeans and her old gray wool coat, looking, if Camille was being honest, better than she'd looked in about 3 years. Not polished better, present better, like something that had been slightly out of focus had sharpened. She ordered a cortado and sat down and told Camille about Richard Aldrin's phone call, about the trust, about the 2 meetings, about the number. Camille stared at her for a long time after she finished. 4.3, she said. Billion, Vivian confirmed. Vivian, I know. How are you? Camille stopped. Started again. Are you okay? Like, actually okay? I think so. Vivian wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I don't feel the way I thought I would feel, if I'm honest. I thought it would feel like, I don't know, winning something, but it doesn't really feel like that. What does it feel like? Vivian was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. It feels like being handed something that was always going to be mine if I just kept being myself, which sounds almost too simple, but that's the closest I can get. Camille took a long sip of her latte. She had a lot of feelings about this information, some of which she was going to need to process privately before she could be useful about it. The one that was clearest and most immediate was something close to fury on Vivian's behalf. Not at the fortune, obviously, but at the fact of Nathan. At 7 years of a man who had looked at this person across the table and seen someone unremarkable, who had publicly, at a party, in a kitchen, referred to her work as her little thing. Does Nathan know? Camille asked. No. Are you going to tell him? Vivian looked at her like the question was genuinely puzzling. Why would I tell him? Camille almost laughed. Right. No. Obviously. She set down her cup. Okay, so what happens now? You run this organization? I chair it, technically. There's a team. Richard's been holding it together for 11 years. She paused. But I'm starting to think about what I want it to do. What direction I want to take it. The arts education stuff. From your foundation work. Maybe. Partly. She tucked a piece of hair behind her ear. I've been thinking about something my grandmother said once, about how the organizations that actually change things are the ones nobody reads about until after. She was allergic to spectacle. Unlike certain ex-husbands, Camille said before she could stop herself. Vivian smiled. It was a real smile, not a polite one. Unlike certain ex-husbands. They stayed at the coffee shop for 2 hours. They talked about the trust, and they talked about Camille's ongoing renovation nightmare, and they talked about a book they'd both been meaning to read, and they didn't talk about Nathan again. But when they hugged goodbye on the sidewalk outside, Camille held on for a second longer than usual. You know what I keep thinking, Camille said. I keep thinking about how many times I watched you make yourself smaller in that marriage, at his events, at his dinners, the way you'd go quiet when he was holding court. And I knew, I always knew, that was a choice you were making, that there was more of you than what was visible. Vivian didn't say anything for a moment. The November wind was picking up, cold and dry and smelling like the city. I didn't know how to be that person and still be in that marriage, she said. I tried for a long time to figure out how to do both, and then I stopped trying. Camille nodded. I know. I'm figuring out how to be her now. She said it simply, without drama, like a fact about the weather. It turns out there's a lot of room. She walked to the corner and raised her hand for a cab and got in, and Camille stood on the sidewalk and watched the cab pull away and thought, that woman is going to be remarkable. She is going to be genuinely, irreversibly remarkable. She had always thought so. It was simply good to finally see the evidence assembling. Quote, the first formal act Vivian took as chair of the Sterling Continuum was a review. Not a sweeping reorganization, not a press conference, not an announcement of any kind. She asked Richard to convene the full staff team for a meeting she described in the email as a listening session. 12 of the 16 staff attended in person. The other 4 dialed in from remote locations. They ranged from a 26-year-old program coordinator named Danny, who had been with the organization for 8 months and looked slightly terrified by the whole situation, to a grants manager named Franklin, who had worked under Eleanor's direction from the very beginning and had, Richard had told her, considered retiring 3 times in the last 2 years and been persuaded to stay each time. Vivian sat at the head of the table and introduced herself without ceremony. I want you to know I didn't grow up knowing about this organization, she said. I knew my grandmother built something. I didn't know what it was. So I'm not coming in here with a 5-year plan and a restructuring proposal. I'm coming in here with a lot of questions and, if it's useful, a genuine interest in understanding what you've built and what you think we should do with it. Silence for a moment. Then Franklin, from the far end of the table, said, That's a different opening than I was expecting. What were you expecting? Honestly, new broom stuff. Come in, move things around, prove she's in charge. He said it without apology. It happens with transition leadership. I'll probably do some of that eventually, Vivian said, but I'm not doing it before I understand what I'd be sweeping out. Franklin studied her for a moment. He had the eyes of someone who had watched a lot of people say the right things in rooms and then proceed to do the expected things, and he was clearly running a rapid assessment. Fair enough, he said. They went around the table. Vivian asked each person to describe what they worked on, what they thought was working, and what they would change if they had the authority. The last question produced the most interesting answers. Danny, who had apparently been sitting on opinions for 8 months, said the grant reporting requirements were 6 times more burdensome than they needed to be and were discouraging smaller organizations from applying. A program manager named Seun said the continuum had been underweighting direct human services in favor of institutional endowments, which was a defensible strategy historically but might need revisiting. Franklin said the affordable housing vehicles needed a structural review because the market had shifted substantially since they were designed. Vivian wrote everything down. She did not immediately respond to any of it with plans or reassurances. She wrote it down and asked follow-up questions. At the end of 2 hours, she thanked everyone and said she'd schedule individual conversations over the next 3 weeks. She asked Franklin to stay behind. He stayed, arms folded, expression carefully neutral. You knew my grandmother well, Vivian said. Better than most. 11 years is a long time to run someone's legacy. Can I ask you something personal? He looked at her. You can ask. Do you think she was right about the test, about making me prove something before I could have access to this? Franklin was quiet for a while, long enough that Vivian began to think he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, I think Eleanor Sterling was the most disciplined person I ever met. And I think she genuinely believed that giving wealth to someone who hadn't been tested by something hard was giving a car to someone who'd never learned to steer. He paused. Whether she was right is a different question, but I think she believed it. What do you think? He uncrossed his arms. I think the test was real, whatever you want to call it. I think you made a choice to leave without trying to take things that weren't yours, and I think that choice was the point. A pause. And I think Eleanor would have liked that you asked me what I thought instead of telling me what you decided. Vivian nodded slowly. I haven't decided anything yet. I know. He picked up his bag from the chair beside him. That's why I'm not retiring. He said it flat, no performance, and walked to the door, and that was the end of the conversation. Vivian sat in the conference room alone for a few minutes afterward. She looked at her legal pad, at the pages of notes she'd accumulated since Richard Aldrin's first call, questions and answers and names and numbers and fragments of things she was starting to understand. She thought about Franklin's phrase, running someone's legacy. 11 years of holding something in trust. 11 years of maintaining what Eleanor had built while waiting for the person who was meant to carry it forward. She thought about what it meant to carry something forward. Not to guard it from the past. Not to preserve it in amber. but to understand it well enough to let it grow in a new direction without losing what made it worth carrying. She had a meeting with Richard the following Tuesday to begin the formal governance transfer. She had 3 weeks of individual staff conversations scheduled. She had a legal pad full of questions and a growing sense of something she could only describe, tentatively, as direction. She was also 38 years old and living in a 460-square-foot apartment in Queens with a broken elevator and a knocking radiator and a box of books she still hadn't unpacked, and every morning she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at the brick wall and thought, "This is where I am. This is what I have. This is who I'm becoming." Nathan was not part of that thought. He existed in a separate compartment now, the way all finished things exist, present only when something retrieves them, and then only briefly. What Vivian hadn't known, when she walked out of that conference room in October with the plain ballpoint pen and her manila folder and Nathan's voice still faintly echoing off the walls behind her, was that the world she was walking into had been waiting the whole time. That the quiet she'd felt in her small apartment wasn't just grief or relief, or the absence of someone else's noise. It was space. Space she hadn't had in a very long time. She was learning how to fill it. December came in hard and cold, the way New York Decembers sometimes do, with a wind off the Hudson that got into the gaps in everything. Vivian bought a new coat, a proper one, charcoal, longer than what she usually wore, and she walked more than she used to, through neighborhoods she hadn't paid much attention to during the years of the marriage, when her geography had been largely organized around Nathan's preferences. She ate at restaurants where she didn't know anyone. She went to a reading at a bookstore in Brooklyn and sat in the back and listened to a novelist talk for 40 minutes about revision and uncertainty and how the books she most valued had all started as failures in their first forms. She went back to her work at the youth arts nonprofit, which she'd kept up quietly through the divorce, 2 mornings a week managing a grant cycle, sitting in meetings with program directors. Nobody there knew about the trust. She hadn't told them. She thought about telling them and then decided to wait, because she needed to understand it herself more fully before she made it a thing that other people had opinions about. She was at a grant review meeting on the second Tuesday of December, sitting around a folding table in a nonprofit office in the South Bronx with 5 program staff and 2 board members, when someone mentioned the Sterling Continuum. Offhand in a list, this funder and that funder in the Continuum, which had provided a multi-year operating grant 3 cycles ago that had been foundational to the organization's growth. Vivian looked at her agenda sheet and said nothing. One of the board members said, "I heard the Continuum's changing leadership. That could go either way for us." The executive director, a woman named Portia, who had done this work for 20 years and had the patient pragmatism of someone who had survived a long time in a field that regularly disappointed, said, "We'll see. What we have is documented. The relationship is solid. If the new leadership is any good, they'll read the record." Vivian made a note on her agenda sheet. She was the new leadership. She had read the record. The operating grant the Continuum had provided 3 cycles ago was in the file she'd reviewed in her first week. She'd flagged this organization specifically because their outcome data was unusually strong. She had thought, sitting in Richard's conference room on Park Avenue, this is an organization worth continuing to invest in. She had not planned to say anything today. She was not here as the Continuum's chair. She was here as a part-time grants manager who had worked in this office for 2 years and knew these people and trusted the work they did. But she wrote it down. Later, walking to the subway, she called Richard. "I want to talk about the South Bronx Youth Arts portfolio," she said. "When?" "This week, if possible. I want to understand the history of those relationships, and I want to talk about whether there's an opportunity to do more than the current grant structure allows." A pause on his end. Not surprised exactly. More like confirmed. "Tuesday at 3, he said. "Tuesday at 3. She put the phone in her coat pocket and descended into the subway, into the particular noise and warmth of the underground, and stood on the platform waiting for the train with her coat collar turned up and her legal pad under her arm. Around her, the city continued doing what it always does, which is to say everything simultaneously, without regard for anyone's particular private turning points. The train came. She got on. She found a seat and opened her legal pad to a fresh page and started writing. Not notes this time, but something closer to a framework. a shape of what the continuum could be if she moved it in the direction she was beginning to see clearly. Not a full plan yet. More like the first visible structure of something that had been forming quietly for weeks, the way ice forms on still water, gradually and then all at once. She wrote for the whole ride back to Astoria, filling 4 pages in her small, steady hand. And when the train pulled into her stop and she climbed the stairs back up into the cold December air and walked the 3 blocks to her building with its broken elevator and its knocking radiator, she took the stairs 2 at a time. She had somewhere to be in the morning. The framework Vivian had written on the train ride home in December took shape slowly over the following weeks, the way most real plans do. Not in a single burst of clarity, but through the accumulation of smaller decisions, conversations, and revisions that gradually cohered into something she could stand behind. By mid-January, she had met individually with all 16 staff members. She had reviewed 5 years of grant records. She had sat through 3 board calls with the Continuum's Advisory Council, a group of 7 people Eleanor had assembled over decades, ranging from a retired federal judge to an economist who had spent 30 years studying structural poverty. They were, collectively, the most rigorous audience Vivian had ever presented to, and she had prepared for each call with the thoroughness of someone who understood that credibility was not inherited along with authority. The Advisory Council had questions. Some of them were pointed. The economist, a woman named Dr. Harriet Voss, who had a direct manner and no apparent interest in diplomatic cushioning, asked in the second call, "What specific qualification do you bring to leading a philanthropic organization of this scale, given that your professional background has been in program-level nonprofit work rather than institutional leadership?" The line was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair question," Vivian said, "and I want to give you an honest answer rather than a packaged one." She paused. "I have 11 years of direct program work in youth education and arts equity. I know what effective implementation looks like at the ground level, which is something institutional leaders often don't. What I don't have is experience managing a portfolio of this size." Another pause. "I intend to rely heavily on this council and on the existing staff knowledge while I build that experience. If that's not a sufficient answer, I'd rather know now than 6 months in." Dr. Voss made a sound that wasn't quite approval, but wasn't dismissal either. "It's an honest answer," she said. "We'll see if it's sufficient." Vivian took that and moved forward. She kept her apartment in Astoria through January and February. The elevator got fixed and broke again. She bought the couch finally, secondhand from a woman on her floor who was moving to Portland, and unpacked the last of the boxes. The apartment still smelled like the Greek restaurant on cold evenings, which she had come to find comforting in an entirely irrational way. She bought a small plant for the kitchen windowsill, the first plant she'd owned in years, and kept it alive with a consistency that felt privately like a minor achievement. She did not think about Nathan deliberately, but he surfaced occasionally in the way that people surface when you've spent 7 years arranging your life around them. In small domestic reflexes, in the habit of considering someone else's preference before your own, in the occasional moment of reaching for a phone to share something before remembering there was no longer anyone on that particular end of the line. She had never been the kind of person who required external validation to function, but she had become, somewhere in the middle years of the marriage, a person who had forgotten what it felt like not to need it. Remembering the difference was its own slow process. Nathan spent January in the mode he was most comfortable in, forward motion. Holloway Capital's third fund was in active close, and the process required a level of investor attention that he found genuinely energizing. He was good at this part. The meetings, the pitch, the calibrated balance of confidence and accessibility that moved institutional money from consideration to commitment. He had a track record that was real and solid. 2 exits in the previous fund, one of them well-timed and well-documented, the kind of result that gave LPs reason to return. Vanessa had moved fully into the 63rd Street apartment by Christmas. She had strong opinions about the kitchen layout, which she expressed clearly and which Nathan accommodated, because he had learned over 3 months of living with her that Vanessa's opinions were rarely negotiable and were also, in most cases, correct. She reorganized the kitchen in a weekend. The kitchen worked better afterward. She was also, he was discovering, less patient with certain aspects of his personality than Vivian had been. Vivian had absorbed a great deal without comment. Vanessa commented, You interrupted Dr. Reyes 3 times during dinner, she said, on the drive home from a dinner party in mid-January, her voice level and factual, not accusatory. I was making a point. You were making his point before he finished making it, which means he spent the rest of the evening not engaging with you. Nathan looked at the road ahead. He's a slow talker. He's a thoughtful talker. There's a difference. She turned to look out the passenger window. Dr. Reyes chairs the investment committee at Carver Institutional. You've been trying to get a meeting with him for 4 months. Nathan said nothing. I'm not criticizing you, Vanessa said. I'm telling you a thing I observed because I thought you'd want to know. Fine. I'll reach out to him this week. That's not the point. Then what's the point? She turned back from the window. The point is that you listen differently when you're competing than when you're learning, and the people worth knowing can tell the difference. He didn't respond to that. He drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was not comfortable and not resolved, and when they got upstairs, he poured himself a drink and stood at the window looking at the street below and told himself that Vanessa was occasionally too analytical about social dynamics and that he didn't need a running commentary on his interpersonal style. But he thought about Dr. Reyes, and he did reach out, and he listened differently in the meeting, and the meeting went well. He didn't connect those 2 facts explicitly, but somewhere under the surface of his forward motion, something was shifting. The invitation arrived in Nathan's office on a Thursday in late February, delivered by courier in a heavy cream envelope with the kind of paper stock that communicated, without words, that the sender had never needed to announce their importance. The return address was a law firm on Park Avenue. He opened it at his desk, standing, because he'd been about to leave for a lunch and didn't have time to sit down with it properly. The Halcyon Foundation for Social Progress cordially invited Mr. Nathan Holloway to its annual recognition gala to be held on the evening of March the 14th at the Metropolitan Pavilion. The gala celebrated institutional leaders whose work had advanced the foundation's mission of equity, access, and community investment. A table had been reserved in his name. Nathan read the invitation twice. He knew the Halcyon Foundation. He had known of it for years in the way that people in his world know of certain institutions, by reputation, by the names attached to its events, by the sense that proximity to it conferred a particular kind of legitimacy. It was not the most prominent of New York's philanthropic organizations. It was something rarer, the kind of organization that the most influential people in the city took seriously precisely because it did not chase prominence. Its gala was invitation only, small by the standards of the sector, and known for assembling a room that was short on performance and long on actual power. He had never been invited before. He read the invitation a 3rd time, looking for the mechanism. A table had been reserved in his name, not an open seat at a purchased table, a reserved table. Someone had specifically wanted him in that room. He thought about who might have arranged it. He ran through a list of contacts, board relationships, his fund's LPs, the network of favors and introductions he'd built over 15 years. He couldn't identify the specific source, but that wasn't unusual. These things moved through channels. Someone had vouched for him somewhere, and the result was sitting in his hand on a Thursday afternoon on paper that cost more per sheet than most people's office supplies. He texted Vanessa, got an invite to the Halcyon Gala, March 14th. Her response came back in under a minute. I know what that is. That's a significant room. He texted back, We're going. She replied with a single word, obviously. He put the invitation in his desk drawer, in the front, where he kept things he needed to remember, and went to his lunch in a better mood than he'd left his office. Vivian did not receive an invitation to the Halcyon Gala. She had been asked, by the Halcyon board, to deliver an address. The request came through Richard, routed via the formal communication channels of the Sterling Continuum, which had a relationship with the Halcyon Foundation that predated Vivian's chairmanship by roughly 20 years. Eleanor had been a quiet, institutional supporter. The Continuum was a named sponsor of the gala series. The board had known, since November, that there was a new chair, and had been in communication with Richard about timing for a more formal introduction. Vivian had been reluctant. I don't want a coming out party, she told Richard in January when the initial conversation came up. That's not how I want to enter this. It's not a coming out party, Richard said. It's a professional introduction to a room that matters, There's a difference. It'll feel like a party. Only to people who don't know what the Halcyon Gala actually is. He folded his hands on the table. Vivian, the organizations in that room collectively direct more than $2 billion annually. Some of them have been waiting to know who the Continuum's new chair is for 11 years. This is not spectacle. This is function. She had thought about it for a week. She'd talked to Camille, who said with characteristic directness, "You have to go. You know you have to go. What you're actually deciding is what you say when you get there." That was the right question. She worked on the address for 3 weeks. Not the language came easily enough, but the substance. What did she actually believe? What did she want to say to a room full of people who moved money and she needed to matter to? She went through 4 drafts, threw out the first 2 entirely, kept the third as a structural skeleton, and rewrote the 4th from the ground up. The final version was 14 minutes long. She read it to Camille on a video call, and Camille said it was good and meant it, which Vivian trusted because Camille was reliably honest, and occasionally too honest, and had never once told her something was good when it wasn't. She also, somewhere in the weeks of preparation, stopped thinking of it as a public debut and started thinking of it as a professional obligation. The difference in framing made it manageable. She bought a dress, navy, simple, nothing that required thinking about. She had more important things to think about. March 14th was a clear night, cold but dry, the kind of New York evening where the city looked more intentional than it usually did, like it had made an effort. The Metropolitan Pavilion was a large event space in Chelsea that had been transformed for the evening into something that read as intimate despite its size. Round tables, low lighting, flowers that were expensive without being excessive. Vivian arrived 30 minutes early, as she always did when she had to speak, because she needed the room before the room needed her. Richard was already there, as expected. He introduced her to 4 people in the first 10 minutes. A program officer from a major hospital system endowment, a board chair from an affordable housing nonprofit, the executive director of an immigrant services organization that the Continuum had quietly funded for 6 years. Vivian had read all of their files. She'd known she'd be meeting them. She asked real questions, and they gave real answers, and she filed the information carefully. The room filled around 7. By 7:30, nearly 120 people occupied the space, and Vivian had been introduced to perhaps 20 of them. She stood with a glass of water. She didn't drink before speaking, and moved through the room at a pace that felt natural rather than strategic, though the line between those two things had become less clear to her over the past several months than it once had been. She was deep in a conversation with the hospital endowment officer about workforce pipeline programs when she saw Nathan. He was across the room, near the bar, with Vanessa beside him. He was wearing the charcoal suit, the same one from the conference room in October, or one identical to it. He was laughing at something the man next to him had said. The particular laugh he used at professional events, slightly louder than his real laugh, calibrated for being overheard. She knew that laugh. She had heard it hundreds of times in rooms like this one. Vanessa was scanning the room, the way Vanessa apparently did everywhere, systematically, assessingly, like she was running a continuous inventory of who mattered and who didn't. She was striking, dark-haired and sharp-featured, in a dress that was clearly chosen with the same strategic deliberateness that characterized, from what Vivian could observe at 40 feet of distance, most of Vanessa's visible behavior. Vivian watched them for perhaps 4 seconds and then returned her full attention to the conversation she was in. The hospital officer was saying something about multi-year commitments. "I think the evidence is pretty clear that one-year grants create more administrative burden than programmatic value," Vivian said. "We've been reviewing our own grant structures with that in mind." She did not look across the room again. Nathan had not seen her, or if he hadn't recognized her at this distance, in this light, in the context of a room where he wouldn't have expected to find her. That was fine. She had 14 minutes of prepared remarks to deliver in about 2 hours. She would deal with whatever happened after that, when it happened. Nathan was having a good evening. The room was exactly what the invitation had implied, small enough to be real, populated by people who weren't there to be photographed. He'd had 3 conversations in the first hour that were substantive and one that was genuinely interesting, with a man named Clifton Brower, who ran a workforce investment fund and had opinions about economic mobility data that Nathan found himself actually engaging with rather than simply waiting to respond to. Vanessa was working the room in her way, which was efficient and transparent, and occasionally made Nathan feel slightly observed by comparison, like she was always running a slight improvement projection on his behavior. But she came back to him between conversations and touched his arm and said, "Clifton Brower, smart, keep him." And he nodded, and the small teamwork of it was something he'd grown to value more than he'd expected. The dinner was good. He was seated next to a woman who managed communications for a public health foundation and was genuinely funny in a dry, offhand way, and across from a man who had spent 15 years in impact investment and had the comfortable authority of someone who had made enough mistakes to know what he was doing. Nathan asked questions and listened with more of his actual attention than he usually allocated at these events, thinking, somewhere under the surface, about what Vanessa had said about listening to learn versus listening to compete. He ate his salmon and drank one glass of wine and felt overall that this was a room he was glad to be in and intended to return to. The program began after dinner. The Halcyon Foundation's executive director gave brief remarks. 2 grant recipients were introduced and spoke for 5 minutes each. Then the director stepped back to the podium and said, "We're honored to close our formal program this evening with remarks from the chair of the Sterling Continuum, who many of you know by institutional reputation, and some of you are meeting for the first time tonight. Vivian Sterling." The applause started, and Nathan heard the name, and he turned toward the front of the room. The woman who walked to the podium was wearing a navy dress. Her dark hair was pulled back. She carried no notes. It took Nathan approximately 3 seconds to process what he was seeing. His wife. His ex-wife. Vivian. Walking to a podium at the Halcyon Foundation Gala to deliver remarks as he had heard the word, he was still processing the word, as the chair of the Sterling Continuum. The Sterling Continuum. Nathan knew that name. He knew it the way he knew a lot of names in the philanthropic sector, imperfectly, in fragments, from the periphery. It was one of those organizations that appeared in the footnotes of things that mattered, that was referenced by people who knew what they were talking about in tones that indicated significance without elaborating on it. He had tried, twice in the past year, to understand how to build a relationship with it as a potential LP, and both inquiries had been routed politely to administrative contacts who had told him, politely, that the Continuum was not accepting new investment relationships at the current time. He had not known who ran it. He had not known it was run by anyone named Sterling. He had not, and this was the fact his mind kept snagging on, the corner of a thought that wouldn't flatten. He had not known that Vivian's last name was Sterling, because for 7 years of marriage, her name had been Vivian Holloway. And before that, before the fundraiser where they'd met, he had known almost nothing about her background, because she had not talked about it, and he had not asked the right questions, and he had been, in the way of men who are confident they understand the important things, not especially curious about the things that weren't immediately legible to him. He was thinking all of this in about 4 seconds. Vivian reached the podium. She looked out at the room for a brief moment, not dramatically, not scanning for anyone specifically, just a speaker orienting to her audience. Her eyes moved across the room without stopping. "The Sterling Continuum has operated quietly for 40 years, she began. Her voice was clear and even and entirely without performance. "My grandmother built it that way by choice. She believed, and I've come to agree, that the organizations most worth trusting are the ones that don't need you to know about them." Nathan sat very still. "But I want to say something tonight that I think is worth saying out loud in a room like this one." She paused. Not for effect. The pause had the quality of someone choosing words accurately rather than dramatically. "Most of the people I've met in this sector came to this work through a direct path. They pursued it, studied it, built careers toward it. I came to it through what I can only describe as a very long and indirect route. The short version is that I spent the last several years learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, the difference between a life built around someone else's goals and a life built around your own." She said it without self-pity, like a reported fact about the weather. "What I want the organizations in this room to know is this. The Continuum is entering an active phase. We've been stewards for 11 years. We intend to be builders for the next phase. The work of building real access to education, to economic participation, to the cultural infrastructure that lets communities recognize themselves as worth investing in. That work is not done by organizations with good intentions. It's done by organizations with staying power and specificity and the willingness to fund things that take longer than a grant cycle to matter. She spoke for 12 minutes. Nathan heard approximately half of it. The other half was lost to the calculation running underneath the surface of his hearing, the one that was rapidly and thoroughly revising every assumption he had made about the woman he had spent 7 years married to and dismissed with a smirk across a conference table in October. The Sterling Continuum. He turned it over in his mind. Sterling. Her name. Her actual name. The one she'd been born with. The one she'd set aside for 7 years while she was Vivian Holloway. He thought about the manila folder she'd carried into the conference room and carried out. What was in it? He had told himself it didn't matter. He had moved on. He had been moving forward. He thought about the settlement. $240,000. She had not negotiated. He had attributed this to a lack of awareness or a lack of ambition, or both. He had been correct about neither. He thought about the invitation in the heavy cream envelope, the table reserved in his name. Someone had wanted him in this room. He had assumed it was good news. He was reconfiguring that assumption in real time, and it was not a comfortable process. Vanessa, beside him, was watching the podium with an expression Nathan recognized. The expression she wore when she was rapidly integrating new information. He glanced at her. She did not glance back. Vivian concluded. The applause was genuine, not the polite kind that fills a room as a social obligation, but the kind that comes from people who heard something they agreed with. Around Nathan, people were clapping and leaning toward their table mates with the small murmur of an audience that has been given something real. Nathan put his hands together. He was not sure what he was doing. He was operating on a surface level while something much less comfortable ran underneath. Vivian left the podium. She moved to the side of the room and was immediately approached by 3 people, then 4, then 6. Nathan watched from across the space as she spoke to each of them in turn. Unhurried, attentive, the same quality of presence he remembered from across the conference table in October, and from 100 dinners and events over 7 years that he was now re-examining with a completely different set of eyes. Vanessa said quietly, close to his ear, "Did you know?" "No," he said. "The Sterling Continuum is, She paused, because she was Vanessa and she chose her words with precision. "That's a serious institution, Nathan." "I know." "She chairs it." "I know." Another pause. Across the room, Vivian was laughing at something the hospital officer had said, not the social laugh, the real one. It was a laugh Nathan had heard before and recognized, and had not, he was realizing now, paid sufficient attention to when it had been directed at him. "We should go say hello," Vanessa said. "Why?" She turned to look at him. "Because it would be strange not to, in a room this size, and because I want to meet her." Nathan said nothing for a moment. He looked at the room, at the people around him, at the low lights, at the Halcyon Foundation banner near the entrance, at the table in his name at a gala he had been so pleased to be invited to. He thought about the invitation again, a table reserved specifically for him. He was now quite certain he knew who had arranged it. "All right," he said. He stood. He was aware, as he did, of a feeling in his chest that he had not experienced in a long time. Not quite shame, not quite fear, something in the register of both that hadn't fully formed into either. He identified it only vaguely and filed it in the same place where he kept most of his less comfortable self-knowledge, which was deep and not often opened. They crossed the room. Vivian was finishing a conversation when she saw them approaching. Nathan watched her face. There was a half-second flicker of something. Not surprise exactly, because she had seen him earlier and he understood that now, but a brief acknowledgement of the moment and what it cost, and then it closed off. She thanked the person she'd been talking to, shook their hand, and turned toward Nathan with the same flat, clear expression he'd been trying to forget since October. "Nathan," she said. "Vivian." He stopped about 3 feet from her. He had no prepared remarks. He had the charcoal suit and a glass of wine he was now holding with more grip than necessary. "I didn't know you were going to be here." "I know," she said. She looked at Vanessa with an expression that was entirely civil and contained no visible edge. Vivian Sterling. Vanessa extended her hand. Vanessa Cole. A pause. Your remarks were excellent. Thank you. She said it simply, not warmly, not coldly. The way you accept a comment from a stranger, Nathan said, because he had to say something, and this was the thing his mouth produced. The continuum. I didn't realize. I didn't know about any of this. Vivian looked at him. The same 2 seconds of that clear assessment. I know that too, she said. There was a silence between the three of them that was only a few seconds long, but had a density to it that Nathan felt across the surface of his skin. He was aware very specifically of the room around them, of the people nearby, of the conversation he'd had 2 months ago with Darren, who had said, what had Darren said? That he'd heard the continuum might be activating, that there was money moving. Nathan had nodded with the professional interest of someone filing a piece of industry information, and he had not asked a single question about who was behind it, because it had not occurred to him to connect it to anything he already knew. I should get back, Vivian said. She looked at them both once more, together, Nathan thought, not separately, as though they formed a single object that she was making a final assessment of. It was good to see you. She walked back toward Richard Aldrin, who was waiting with a patient expression at the edge of the room. Nathan watched her go. Vanessa was quiet for a moment, then, she didn't arrange the invitation to humiliate you. I know. She arranged it because this is the world she operates in, and a table in your name is a professional courtesy to someone her organization has peripheral business dealings with. I know. And it worked out the way it worked out because of what it is, not because she planned for you to feel the way you're feeling right now. Nathan set his wine glass down on the nearest table. Are you enjoying this? Vanessa looked at him, not unkindly. I'm watching my partner realize something he should have figured out a long time ago. No, I'm not enjoying it, but I'm not going to pretend it isn't happening either. She picked up her own wine. Come on, I need to talk to Clifton Brower before we leave. Nathan followed her back into the room, and the gala continued around him, and Vivian Sterling across the space was deep in a conversation with 2 people he recognized from the board of a major research university, speaking with the easy authority of someone who had done her homework and knew exactly where she stood. He found, when he tried to remember what he'd said in that conference room in October, the speech about contributions, about her ordinary involvement, about what was fair, that he could not reconstruct it word for word. He could only remember the smirk, the comfortable confidence with which he had explained her life back to her. He could remember very clearly her signature on the papers. Neat, unhurried, the way she did most things. The drive home from the gala was quiet, in the way that certain silences are quiet, not empty, but full of things neither person has decided yet whether to say. Vanessa looked out the passenger window for most of the ride. Nathan kept his eyes on the road and his hands at a precise position on the wheel that was slightly more deliberate than his usual grip. The city moved past them, bright and indifferent, and neither of them spoke until they were almost back to 63rd Street. I want to ask you something, Vanessa said, still looking at the window. Go ahead. When you were married to her, did you ever ask about her family, her background, where the Sterling name came from? Nathan was quiet for a moment. We talked about her family. That's not what I asked. He pulled up to the building. The doorman moved toward the car. Nathan sat for a second before getting out. She didn't talk about it much. I didn't push. Vanessa nodded once, the way she nodded when she had received the answer she expected and found it neither surprising nor satisfactory. She got out of the car without elaborating, and Nathan followed, and they rode the elevator up in the same loaded silence that had occupied the car. And when they got inside the apartment, Vanessa poured herself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter, the reorganized kitchen, the one that worked better now, and looked at him. I need to understand something about you, she said. All right. Is this the first time something like this has happened, where you've had a significant misread of someone close to you? Nathan took off his jacket, hung it on the hook by the door, the hook Vanessa had installed because he had previously draped jackets on chairs. He turned around. What do you mean by significant misread? I mean, Have you been in other situations where you decided who someone was early and then found out later that you had missed something important? He looked at her. She was asking the question the way she asked most difficult questions, directly, without the softening that would make it easier to deflect. Vanessa was not interested in easy deflections. It was one of the things he valued about her, and one of the things that made living with her feel occasionally like being called as a witness in a case he hadn't prepared for. Probably, he said. Probably. I don't know. Yes, I think most people have. Most people, she said, don't look their ex-wife in the eye at a professional gala after spending a year telling anyone who'll listen that she had no ambition and contributed nothing, and then find out she chairs a multi-billion-dollar foundation. She paused. That's a specific kind of misread, Nathan. That's not a minor revision. He sat down on the couch. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I know what it is. I don't think you've let yourself fully know yet. She wasn't saying it to hurt him. She was saying it the way she said most true things, because it was true and because she believed, fundamentally, in not allowing important things to go unnamed. I think you're still processing the surface of it, the professional embarrassment, the calculation of who saw what in that room tonight. You think I don't understand my own reaction. I think you understand the version of it that's about appearances. I'm not sure you've gotten to the version that's about what actually happened in that marriage. She picked up her glass of water. I'm not going to push on it tonight, but I want you to think about it. Not for my sake, for yours. She went to bed. Nathan sat on the couch in the apartment that had been Vivian's apartment too for 7 years and looked at the room around him. The reorganized kitchen was visible through the open doorway. The lamp on the side table, one of the few original pieces left, everything else had been gradually replaced in the year since the divorce, cast a low, warm light. He thought about the lobby exchange shelf downstairs, where he had placed the lamp and the small mirror Vivian had left behind. He wondered if they were still there or if someone had taken them. He had not thought about that detail in months. He thought about the conference room in October, about the charcoal suit, about his carefully prepared speech regarding her contributions, delivered with the confidence of a man who believed he was being generous rather than diminishing. He sat with it for a long time, in a way that was not his habit and was not comfortable, and then he went to bed without having resolved anything, which was also not his habit, and which stayed with him into the following morning. The professional consequences of the gala arrived not in a dramatic event, but in the gradual shift of temperature that Nathan began to register over the weeks that followed. It was nothing he could point to directly, nothing anyone said to his face. It was more like a recalibration, the way a room full of people who have received new information about someone quietly adjusts, without announcement, in ways that only become visible in aggregate. Douglas Merritt, the prospective LP Nathan had lunched with in November, moved from warm to polite in their communications. He had been close to committing to the third fund. His response to Nathan's February follow-up had been prompt and engaged. His response to the March follow-up, sent 2 weeks after the gala, was brief and suggested a timeline that pushed any decision to the fourth quarter. It could have been anything. Portfolio reallocation, board pressure, a dozen unrelated factors. Nathan told himself that because it was true, and because the alternative required a chain of cause and effect, he wasn't prepared to fully construct. His colleague Trent Bayfield mentioned at an industry lunch in late March that he'd been at the Halcyon Gala. Interesting room, Trent said, without looking up from his menu. It was a good event, Nathan said. Vivian Sterling gave a strong address. Trent said it the way you say something when you're watching to see how it lands. She did, Nathan said, because there was no version of disagreeing with that which didn't make things worse. Trent nodded and changed the subject, and the lunch continued, and nothing further was said. But Nathan noticed. He was good at reading rooms when he was paying attention. He was paying attention now, with a sharpness he hadn't felt necessary before, and what he was reading was the subtle difference between how people engaged with him in January and how they engaged with him in April. It was not universal. Most relationships were unchanged, but the ones at the edges, the newer relationships, the ones still deciding whether Nathan Holloway was a man worth serious investment of time and trust, those had cooled, almost imperceptibly, in a direction he couldn't reverse with a pitch deck. He called his attorney Carla Britton in early April. He told her he wanted to review the divorce settlement. There was a brief pause on the line. What aspect of it? The full document. I want to read it. Another pause, shorter. Nathan, you read the settlement. I read the first 4 pages. You handled the rest. A silence that had professional judgment in it. I'll send it over, she said. He read it that evening. All 41 pages. He was a thorough reader when he chose to be, and he chose to be now, sitting at his desk with the document on his screen and the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for term sheets and investment memoranda. The settlement was, as Carla had described it at the time, straightforward. Division of jointly held assets, retention of separately held assets, a clean spousal support waiver signed by both parties, and a final clause on page 38 that he had not read and had not asked about, and which his attorney had not flagged as requiring particular attention because, from a legal standpoint, it required none. The clause was 4 sentences. It stated that both parties acknowledged no claim, present or future, to assets held in separate trust, inheritance, or estate vehicle by either party, and that by execution of the agreement each party waived any and all interest in such assets regardless of their nature, character, or value, known or unknown at the time of signing. Known or unknown at the time of signing. Nathan read the sentence 3 times. He sat back in his chair. He had signed that clause. He had signed the entire document without reading it because Carla had read it, and he trusted Carla, and because he had been sitting in that conference room in October with his cufflinks catching the light and Vivian across the table looking at the window, primarily interested in the speed and cleanliness of the outcome rather than its details. He had been so confident there was nothing of consequence to miss. He called Carla back. The trust waiver on page 38, he said. Yes. Was that standard language? It was negotiated language. A pause. Her attorney introduced it. It was a mutual waiver. Both parties gave up any claim to the other's separately held trust or inheritance assets. You didn't flag it. There was nothing to flag, Nathan. You had no separately held trust assets. From your side of the agreement, it was a neutral clause. From her side, Carla paused, and in the pause, Nathan heard the thing she was deciding whether to say. At the time, I had no reason to believe she had significant separately held assets either. Her financial disclosure was accurate and complete. What she held in trust was not subject to mandatory disclosure under the applicable framework, and her attorney was careful to stay within those lines. She knew, Nathan said. She knew what her attorney advised her to know, Carla said, in the precise tone of someone who has been a lawyer for 20 years and understands the difference between what is said and what is meant. The clause was legal, the negotiation was proper, everything was above board. Nathan ended the call. He sat at his desk with the settlement on his screen and looked at page 38 for a long time. He was not a man who was easy to surprise. He had spent 15 years in venture capital, a field that selected for pattern recognition and skepticism, and he believed generally that he was good at seeing around corners. He had not seen around this corner. He had walked past it at full speed, eyes forward, supremely confident in the accuracy of his own assessment. He thought about what Vanessa had said, the version that's about what actually happened in that marriage. He was not ready to go there fully, but the door to it had been open for weeks, and it was getting harder to walk past. Vanessa noticed the shift in him the way she noticed most things, quietly, without making it a subject of immediate discussion, storing the observation until she had enough data to do something useful with it. Nathan was sleeping less cleanly. He was distracted in meetings in a way that was unlike him. He had started revisiting conversations they'd had weeks ago, picking them back up in the middle of dinner or in the car, as though his mind was running a background process that occasionally surfaced without warning. She gave it 3 weeks before she said anything. They were at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in late April, Nathan with coffee and his phone, Vanessa with the financial section of the paper she still insisted on receiving in print, when she said, without preamble, "You've been living in that gala for 6 weeks." He looked up from his phone. "I've been busy." "That's not what I said." He put the phone down. "What do you want me to say, Vanessa?" "I want you to say what you're actually thinking, not the summary version, the real version." He was quiet for a while. Outside, the Sunday morning sounds of 63rd Street moved through the window, unhurried. A delivery truck, someone's dog. The distant frequency of the city that never fully went quiet. I think I spent 7 years being condescending to a person who was more substantial than I understood, he said. And I think I did it in ways that were visible, to people who mattered, and I think I'm dealing with the results of that now. Vanessa folded the paper. That's the professional version. I know. What's the personal version? He looked at the table. I don't know if I'm ready to say the personal version. Okay. She unfolded the paper again. When you're ready. He appreciated that about her. The patience that didn't pretend to be more patience than it was. She was not infinitely patient. She had a clear limit and a clear way of communicating when it was approaching. But she gave him room inside that limit in a way that had recalibrated, gradually and without announcement, his understanding of what a functional partnership felt like. He thought about Vivian in the early years, the quality he had valued in her that had later come to frustrate him, her stillness, her self-containment, the sense that she had a whole interior life that didn't require his participation. He had called it passivity. He had called it a lack of ambition. He was understanding now, with the particular clarity of retrospect and consequence, that it had been something else entirely. It had been independence, a self-sufficiency of identity that he had experienced not as a gift, but as a withholding, because it meant there was a version of Vivian that he hadn't been able to access or influence or take any credit for, and that had made him quietly resentful in ways he had never named. He had not been a monster. He needed to be careful about that construction, the easy slide from accountability to self-indictment that resolved nothing. He had not been cruel in the ways that left marks. He had been inattentive, dismissive in the small, daily, accumulated ways that don't look like anything until you add them up over 7 years and see the total. He had treated her competence as ordinary, her interior life as decoration, her work as a hobby, and her presence as a given, until the given walked out of the conference room with a manila folder, and he discovered months later, standing in a room full of people who knew exactly who she was, that the ordinary and the decoration and the hobby and the given were the substance of a person he had never actually looked at. He sat with that on the Sunday morning in late April with his cold coffee and the sound of the city outside, and it was not a comfortable thing to sit with, and he sat with it anyway. It was the closest thing to honesty he had managed in months. Holloway Capital's third fund closed in May, but short of its target. Nathan had set an ambitious cap and reached 83% of it, which was a functional close and not an embarrassment by any absolute standard. But he had told Vanessa in February that he expected a full close, and several of the LPs he had expected to anchor the final tranche had moved to a wait-and-see posture that hadn't resolved before the close date. He told himself it was market conditions, interest rates, allocation pressures, the general tightening in the private capital landscape that every fund manager was navigating. All of that was real, all of that contributed, but he was honest enough privately to know that it wasn't the whole story. Some of what had happened in the months since October was about him, about the particular way that professional reputation operates in small and interconnected worlds, where information travels not through announcements but through the gradual adjustment of how people lean toward you in a room. His friend Darren had said it most directly, because Darren was one of the few people in his life who said things directly. They were at a bar in Midtown in May, the kind of place they'd been going to since their early 30s, when this particular area of Midtown had seemed more relevant than it did now, and Darren had had 2 drinks and reached whatever threshold Darren reached before he said true things. "I'm going to tell you something," Darren said. "I know that tone," Nathan said. "Go ahead." People in this space, the people who matter, the institutional relationships, the board-level connections, they talk. You know this. I know this. And the conversation around you in the last 6 months has not been the conversation you want. Darren turned his glass on the bar. Nobody's saying anything specific. Nobody's out there running a campaign. But after the Halcyon Gala, a few people who were warm on you moved to neutral. And a few people who were neutral moved to watching. Nathan said nothing. "The story as people have reconstructed it," Darren continued, "is a man who married a woman from a significant family, spent 7 years not knowing or not caring to know who she actually was, divorced her in a way that multiple people in that room apparently witnessed directly or heard about, and then showed up to a gala where she was the featured speaker as if none of it happened. He paused. That's not a scandal, but it's a story about judgment, and people in this business care about judgment more than they care about almost anything. Nathan turned his own glass. I didn't know about the trust. I understand that. So does everyone else. That's not the part they're reacting to. Darren looked at him. The part they're reacting to is how you talked about her. The upgrade comment. The nothing to contribute speech. A few people heard those things directly. More people heard them secondhand. And now those same people have watched her walk to a podium and deliver a serious address at one of the most respected philanthropic gatherings in the city. Nathan looked at the bar. I'm not here to pile on, Darren said. I'm here because you're my friend, and I think you need to hear this clearly, rather than piece it together from signals. He picked up his drink. The fund closed. You'll build from here, but you need to understand what you're rebuilding from. Nathan sat with that through the rest of the evening, through the cab ride home, through the quiet of the apartment where Vanessa was already asleep. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and thought about the words he had used: upgrade, contribute nothing, going back to being nobody. And he heard them now the way they sounded to other people, rather than the way they had felt to him in the moment of using them. They did not sound, from the outside, like the words of a man with good judgment. They sounded like the words of a man who needed someone to be smaller than him and had arranged for it. He had not intended them that way. He was fairly sure he had not intended them that way. But intention was not the whole of a thing, and he was learning that slowly and at some cost. The engagement announcement had not been formally made. They were not engaged. Nathan had thought about it in February in the abstract way he thought about most future events, as a logical next step, as a piece of a broader architecture. Vanessa was the right person. She was capable and direct and made his life better in concrete ways. He had planned, loosely, to propose sometime in the fall. What changed was not a single conversation, but a series of smaller ones that built pressure at a joint he hadn't examined carefully enough. Vanessa raised it in June, not as a confrontation, but as a question, which was her way. Are we moving towards something, or are we comfortable where we are? I thought we were moving towards something, Nathan said. I thought so too. She was sitting on the windowsill with her legs folded under her, coffee in both hands, the late afternoon light coming in at an angle that made the apartment look warmer than it was. I want to talk about what I've been watching since March. All right. I've watched you spend 3 months processing the fact that you misread your ex-wife, which is fair. That's a real thing to process. She looked at him over the coffee cup. But I've also watched you do it in a way that's mostly about the professional cost, the fund, the room's perception of you, the story people are telling. She paused. I have not watched you do the other version of it. I told you in April. You gave me the outline in April. That's not the same as doing the work. She uncurled from the windowsill, stood, moved to the chair across from him. She was not angry. She was precise, which was sometimes harder to deal with than anger. Nathan, I chose to be with you because I thought you were a person who understood the difference between what looks like success and what actually is. I still think that's in there. But I've been watching you confuse the recovery of your professional image with the recovery of your actual self-knowledge. And those are not the same project. He looked at her. What do you want from me? I want you to understand why you treated her the way you did. Not as a performance of accountability. Actually understand it. She held his gaze. Because if you don't, you're going to do some version of the same thing again. Maybe not with me. Maybe not in the same way. But the pattern is real. And patterns don't go away because you've had an embarrassing consequence. The apartment was very quiet. I don't know if I can do that on the timeline you're imagining, Nathan said. I'm not on a timeline, she said. I'm on a standard. There's a difference. She set her coffee down. I love you. I think you're worth this conversation. But I need to see it land somewhere real, or we are going to hit a wall that I don't want to hit. Nathan sat with that for a long time. The engagement he had planned for the fall did not happen. Not because Vanessa left, and not because Nathan left, but because they were both honest enough by September to agree that they had reached a place that required more than the momentum of a logical next step. Vanessa moved to her own apartment in October. Not an ending, she said, and she meant it, but a pause that was honest rather than a continuation that wasn't. They had dinner twice a month through the fall. The conversations were better than they had been when they were living together, which told Nathan something about himself that he found uncomfortable and important in equal measure. He saw a therapist for the first time in his life in August, referred by his doctor at an annual physical where he'd reported, almost as an afterthought, difficulty sleeping and a persistent low-grade sense that he had lost a footing he didn't know how to recover. The therapist was a straightforward man named Dr. Ellison, who had an office on the Upper West Side and asked inconvenient questions without apparent remorse. The first 3 sessions were mostly Nathan explaining himself, which was what Nathan did when he felt uncertain. The 4th session, Dr. Ellison said, "You've told me a great deal about what happened and very little about how you feel about it. Not the professional consequences. How you feel." Nathan looked at the middle distance. "Ashamed," he said. It was the first time he'd used that word. It sat in the air of the quiet office with a weight he hadn't anticipated. Of what specifically? Of who I was in that marriage. He said it slowly. I think I needed her to be less than she was, because it made me more than I was. And I was never honest with myself about that. I called it disappointment. I called it growing apart. He stopped. I called it an upgrade. Dr. Ellison wrote something on his notepad. What do you call it now? Nathan looked at his hands. I call it a long time to spend not seeing someone who was right in front of me. He drove home from that session through October traffic, through the city that moved as it always moved, and he thought about the conference room, the charcoal suit, the pen he had brought, engraved, sitting uncapped on his side of the table when Vivian walked out with her plain ballpoint in her folder. He had thought, that day, that he was watching someone leave. He understood now, at a cost he was still tallying, that he had been watching someone arrive. He drove the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that isn't comfortable and isn't meant to be. And he thought about the word he'd said in Dr. Ellison's office, and he thought about how long it had been waiting to be said, sitting in the back of all those forward-moving months, patient and unmoved as a debt that doesn't lose interest. He had been many things in the past year, and most of them had required the kind of reckoning he had never previously believed applied to him. He was still working out what to do with that. The October that followed was different from the October before it, though Vivian would not have said that out loud to most people, because it sounded like the kind of thing people say when they are trying too hard to mark their own progress. But it was different, measurably, quietly different. She had moved out of the Astoria apartment in July, not because she'd felt pressure to, but because she had found a place in Brooklyn, Carroll Gardens, a floor-through and a brownstone on a tree-lined block that felt like the first space she'd ever chosen entirely on her own terms, without reference to anyone else's geography or preference or the particular social logic of which neighborhood said, what about a person? It had high ceilings and a small backyard and a kitchen with actual counter space and a bedroom that got the morning light. She paid for it herself, out of the operational draw she'd established through the Continuum's governance structure, a draw she had deliberately kept modest because she was not interested in the version of herself that confused access to significant resources with permission to stop being careful. She took the plant from the Astoria kitchen windowsill and put it in the Brooklyn kitchen windowsill, where it continued to live with the same stubborn indifference to neglect that had characterized it from the beginning. She unpacked everything properly this time. She hung things on walls. She bought a dining table large enough for 6 people, which she had not owned at any point during the marriage because Nathan had preferred to entertain at restaurants, a preference she had accommodated for 7 years without ever fully examining her own feeling about it, which was that she liked feeding people in her own home and had missed doing it. She had people for dinner twice a month through the summer. Camille came, and Franklin from the Continuum staff, and Richard Aldrin once, who turned out to be unexpectedly good company outside of a professional context, and who had a dry commentary on the philanthropic sector that made Vivian laugh genuinely enough that she spilled her wine. Dr. Harriet Voss, the economist from the Advisory Council who had asked the pointed qualification question in February, came in August and stayed 3 hours and argued with Vivian about impact measurement methodology in a way that was entirely combative and entirely productive, and ended with them agreeing to commission a review, which they did, and which produced findings that changed 2 of the Continuum's grant evaluation frameworks. Vivian's life, in other words, was accumulating the texture of a life rather than the texture of a role. It was not without difficulty. There were weeks when the learning curve of institutional leadership felt vertical, when the board disagreed with the direction she'd proposed, when a staff departure required an uncomfortable performance conversation, when a funding decision she'd made with full information still turned out to be wrong in ways she had to acknowledge publicly and correct. There were evenings when she sat in the Carroll Gardens apartment after a long day and felt the specific tiredness of someone who had taken on more than they previously carried and was still, honestly, figuring out if their shoulders were wide enough. She did not solve this by pretending it wasn't hard. She solved it to the degree that it was solvable by continuing. She met Adrian Mercer in September at an event she had been obligated to attend and had not particularly wanted to. The event was a panel discussion on workforce development policy hosted by a think tank that the Continuum had a small legacy relationship with. Vivian had agreed to attend as a representative of the Foundation's workforce investment interests, which was a fine reason to be somewhere and also a perfectly accurate one. But the panel itself had run long, and the subsequent reception was the kind of stand-up affair where you hold a drink you're not drinking and have 7 4-minute conversations while waiting to leave. She was having one of those conversations with a policy researcher who had interesting things to say about apprenticeship models in healthcare, when she became aware of a man standing nearby who was not pretending to be part of a conversation. He was simply standing near the window with a glass of water, reading the program guide with what appeared to be genuine interest, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. He was around her age, maybe a few years older, with the kind of face that was easier to read than most, not because he was simple, but because he wasn't doing anything to make it harder. No performance of ease, no social positioning. He was just there, in the room, reading. She finished her conversation and moved toward the window, not specifically toward him, but in that direction, because there was an empty space there that was appealing. He looked up when she was nearby. "Do you know who Ellery Chambers is?" he asked, holding up the program. "He's listed as a founding contributor, but I can't find him in the bio section." Vivian looked at the program. He died in 2019. He was one of the original architects of the CTE expansion in California. Very quiet about it. The man nodded. "Of course. The quiet ones are always the interesting ones." He looked at the program again, then back at her. "Adrian Mercer. I consult on workforce pipeline design, mostly community college to employer. I'm here because my client is presenting later." Vivian Sterling. She shook his hand. "I'm here because my foundation has a legacy relationship with the hosting organization, and I said yes to the invitation before I read the full program." He smiled. It was a real smile, not an event smile. "Is the full program bad?" "The panel was good. The reception has been exactly what receptions always are." "Which is?" "A room full of people who would rather be having 5 real conversations than 45 introductory ones." He laughed. "Fair. Are you interested in a real conversation, or are you still in the 45 stage?" She considered him for a moment. "One real conversation. I'll let you know when I'm done with it." They talked for 40 minutes. He had been in workforce development for 12 years, had a background in economics, and a genuine interest in the human specifics of how people moved, or failed to move, between education and employment. He asked questions about the Continuum's workforce portfolio that were informed and direct, and when she pushed back on one of his assumptions about employer incentive structures, he revised his position rather than defended it, which she noted as a relevant data point. He was not trying to impress her. That was the thing she kept coming back to, riding the subway home afterward. He had been interested, genuinely interested, in the conversation they were having, and he had not once angled it toward anything she might give him professionally or otherwise. He had just talked to her the way you talk to someone whose company you find worthwhile, and when the event wound down and they exchanged cards, he said, "I'd like to continue this. There's more to say about the pipeline model." "There is," she agreed. "Coffee next week?" "Coffee next week." She got home, fed the plant its bi-weekly water, and sat on the couch thinking that she had not allowed herself to be curious about a person in a long time. Not in the way she'd felt curious tonight, not performing interest or managing conversation, but actually wanting to know what someone thought. actually finding it worth staying for. It was a small thing. But small things, she had learned, were often the beginning of the actual things. They had coffee the following Wednesday. They had dinner 2 weeks after that. The dinner ran 3 hours and covered workforce data, the ethics of private philanthropy, a documentary they'd both seen about Appalachian manufacturing communities, and a disagreement about whether institutional change was more effectively driven from inside existing structures or from the outside building pressure. Vivian argued inside, Adrian argued outside. Neither of them convinced the other, and both of them enjoyed the argument. He was not, she discovered over the weeks that followed, an easy person in all the ways that mattered. He had opinions he held firmly and examined regularly, which was better than the alternative of either holding them loosely or not examining them at all. But it meant that conversations with him were rarely frictionless. He had been divorced 5 years earlier, a fact he mentioned without drama and without extended narrative, which she respected. He had a daughter, 11 years old, who lived primarily with her mother in New Jersey and who he drove to see every other weekend and several weeknights, a commitment he scheduled around without apology or complaint. He was not performing the part of a good man. He was just doing the things that a person does when they are one. She told Camille about him on a Sunday afternoon in October, sitting in the Carroll Gardens backyard with the last warm afternoon of the season spending itself on the brick walls and the potted herbs Vivian had planted in August, 3 of which had survived with distinction. "How serious?" Camille asked. "I don't know yet." Vivian turned her face up to the sun. "I'm not trying to know yet." "That's new?" "What do you mean?" Camille stretched in her chair. "I mean, you're usually very decisive. You know what you think about things very quickly, and you act on it. The fact that you're sitting with not knowing, that's different." Vivian thought about that. "I think I'm learning to be slower about things I actually care about, as opposed to things you don't care about. As opposed to things I care about so much I rush past them before I've actually looked." She paused. "I spent a lot of years in a marriage arranging myself to fit something that didn't fit. And I did it quickly, at the beginning, because the quickness felt like decisiveness, and decisiveness felt like strength." She looked at the surviving herbs on the back step. "I think sometimes slow is more honest." Camille was quiet for a moment. "I like him," she said, though she'd only met Adrian once, briefly, for about 10 minutes outside a restaurant. "You met him for 10 minutes. I know. I still like him." She picked up her coffee. "He looked at you when you were talking to me, not in a possessive way, like he was interested in what you were saying." Vivian considered that. "He usually is." "That's the whole thing, isn't it?" Camille said, not as a question. It was. That was the whole thing. A person who was interested in what you were actually saying, rather than in the version of you that was most convenient to them. It was a low bar, objectively, but it was amazing how much of a life could be built on the wrong side of it without anyone noticing until you crossed it and felt the difference underfoot. Adrian met Franklin at a Continuum staff event in November. A low-key gathering, a catered dinner in the office for staff and a few external partners. The kind of thing organizations do when they want to mark a year without making it formal. He came as Vivian's guest and spent 40 minutes talking to Franklin about legacy endowment structures, and Franklin said afterward, finding Vivian at the drinks table, "He's not trying to be impressive." "I know," Vivian said, that's harder than it looks." Franklin refilled his glass. "Most people in rooms like this spend 40% of their energy managing how they're coming across. He just talked." Vivian smiled. "He just talked." Franklin looked across the room to where Adrian was now listening to Danny, the program coordinator, explain something with animated hands. "How's it going?" "Carefully," Vivian said. "Carefully smart." He turned back to her. "You know what Eleanor would have thought." "I have a guess." "She would have said the same thing she said about everything. Watch what people do when there's nothing to gain." He raised his glass slightly. 11 months in, and this organization looks different than it did. In a way that matters. That's what she was waiting to see. Vivian looked at her own glass. The year was arranging itself in her mind the way years do, in the odd and non-chronological way that significant years tend to arrange themselves, not as a sequence of events, but as a series of textures, feelings, moments of arrival. The Astoria apartment in November with its radiator and its Greek restaurant smell and the feeling of space she hadn't experienced in years. Richard Aldrin's voice on the phone saying 4.3 billion, sitting on the floor with her back against the unpacked couch, with a legal pad, trying to understand what she'd been given. Franklin saying, the first time they'd talked honestly, "That's why I'm not retiring." The Halcyon Gala in March, Nathan across the room in the charcoal suit, and her own voice at the podium, steadier than she'd expected, saying the things she'd spent weeks deciding were worth saying. The plant on the windowsill in Brooklyn, still alive. Adrian at the other end of the dinner table last Sunday, disagreeing with her about public-private partnership models, with the specific quality of engagement that meant he'd thought about it before and was thinking about it more carefully now. The year was a collection of those moments, and underneath them all was the same unifying fact. She was the one who had made them, not by having the right plan or the right inheritance or the right luck, but by making the choices she made, to leave, to sign, to take the small apartment, to read the binder, to ask Franklin what he thought rather than tell him what she'd decided, to walk to the podium and say what she meant, to be slow about Adrian, to keep the plant alive. Small choices, individually. In aggregate, they were a life that belonged entirely to herself. The letter from Nathan arrived in early December. She had not expected it and did not immediately open it. It sat on her kitchen table for 2 days, an envelope with her Carroll Gardens address in Nathan's handwriting, which she recognized from 7 years of grocery lists and travel itineraries, and the one time he'd written her a birthday card that said something real rather than something purchased. She looked at it and decided not to rush, which had become a practice of hers, and on the third day she opened it with her morning coffee. It was 2 pages, handwritten, and it was not a smooth letter. It started twice, the second start visible where he'd crossed out the first 2 sentences and begun again from a slightly different angle. She had expected, vaguely, that if he ever wrote she would find it either manipulative or pathetically self-serving, and it was neither of those things. It was simply a man trying to say something he should have said earlier and finding it harder than he'd anticipated. He wrote that he had spent a year understanding, slowly and at cost, how he had behaved in the marriage. Not the circumstance of it, not the trust, not the money, not the professional consequences he had not foreseen. The behavior itself. The condescension that had been so constant and so reflexive that he had mistaken it for honesty. The way he had needed her to be less than she was. He wrote, "I told myself I was disappointed in you. I think the more accurate thing is that I was threatened by you, and I was not honest enough with myself about that to examine it until I had no choice." He wrote that he was not asking for anything. He was not trying to open a door he had no right to expect was still there. He was writing because he had been told, by someone he respected, that accountability without communication was a private exercise that served the accountable person more than the person they had wronged, and he thought that was probably true. He wished her well and meant it. He said he hoped the continuum was becoming what she wanted it to be. He said she had been right to leave and he was sorry it had taken him this long to say so. He signed it Nathan, without surname, without the full formality, and without the presumption of intimacy. Just the first name, which was somehow the most honest choice in the letter. Vivian read it twice. She sat with it for a while, the way she sat with most things now, without rushing to the response. She did not feel the triumphant clarity that people in stories were supposed to feel when they received this kind of letter. She felt something more complicated and more ordinary than that. A mixture of recognition and residual grief and something close to relief. Not at Nathan's accounting of himself, but at the fact that it was possible to move this far from a thing that had once been the central architecture of her life. She had been inside that marriage the way you are inside a structure, not seeing its shape from the outside, unable to step back far enough to understand its dimensions. She could see it now, clearly and without distortion, and what she saw was not a villain's construction. It was a slow failure. 2 people who had not been honest enough about what they needed, and one of them who had used the other's silence as permission to expand, and neither of them who had said the true thing at the moment when the true thing might have changed something. She was not angry at Nathan. She had stopped being angry sometime in the late spring, when she had been too busy building something real to sustain the energy of anger at something finished. What she felt, reading the letter, was something closer to ordinary human sadness for the years that had been what they had been. An ordinary human acknowledgement of a person trying, late and imperfectly, to do right by a situation he had not handled well. She put the letter in her document box, where she kept things that mattered, and she did not write back. Not because she was punishing him, but because there was nothing she needed to say that the silence didn't say more accurately. The chapter was closed, not with triumph, not with forgiveness performed for anyone's benefit, but with the quiet completion that comes when both people have finally said what was true, and there is nothing left that requires the other person. She washed her coffee cup and went to work. Adrian told her he loved her in January, on a Tuesday evening in the Carroll Gardens apartment. In the completely unstaged way that real things tend to happen, they had been doing dishes after dinner, an argument about urban zoning policy trailing off into comfortable quiet, and he had handed her a wet plate and said, without preamble or particular drama, "I love you. I wanted to say that while we were doing something ordinary so you'd know I mean it in the ordinary way, not just the impressive moments." She took the plate. She looked at him. "The ordinary way," she said. "Every Tuesday doing dishes way. Not just the good dinner, good conversation, everyone dressed, well, way." She put the plate on the drying rack. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I was being slow. I know you were. It was fine." He handed her another plate. "I wasn't going anywhere." That was the whole of it. Standing at the kitchen sink with wet hands and the sound of the street outside and the plant on the windowsill behind them. No orchestration, no perfect moment designed for the memory of it. Just a person handing her a plate and saying the real thing while they were doing something ordinary, because he had understood, without being told, that ordinary was the version of her life she had fought hardest to build. She had not known, standing in that conference room 14 months earlier with Nathan's voice moving through the room and the papers in front of her and the pen in her hand, that ordinary would be the word she would come to value most. She had not known what was on the other side of the signature. She had known only what she was walking away from, and that it was past time to walk. The dishes took another 10 minutes. They talked about something unrelated, his daughter's school project, a request from the Continuum's board about the spring grant cycle, a movie neither of them had seen, but both wanted to. The kind of conversation that doesn't remember itself because it doesn't need to. The kind that exists simply as the texture of being in a life together. The Continuum's annual report for its first full year under Vivian's leadership was released in February, 2 years after the divorce. It did not announce itself as a new direction or a transformed institution, or any of the things that press materials typically say when organizations want to appear consequential. It was 112 pages of grants, outcomes, program data, and a letter from the chair that was 3 pages long and said, among other things, "We believe the most important work is the work nobody will read about for another decade." Dr. Harriet Voss called Vivian after reading it and said, without preamble, "Your grandmother would have approved of this document." "That means more than you probably intended it to," Vivian said. "I intended it quite a lot," Dr. Voss said. A pause. "I was skeptical of you in February of last year. I want you to know that I am not skeptical of you now." "I know," Vivian said. "Don't be smug about it." "I'm not. I'm grateful for the skepticism. It made me sharper." Another pause, and then Dr. Voss said something that was probably the closest she came to warmth in professional context. "Good. Keep being sharp." And she hung up, which was also consistent with her character. Franklin left the organization in March, finally, on his own timeline, with a retirement party at the Carroll Gardens apartment that involved 17 people and good food, and a speech from Franklin that was 4 minutes long and entirely without sentimentality until the last 30 seconds, when his voice shifted just enough that nobody mentioned it. He pulled Vivian aside before he left and said, "You know what Eleanor got right?" "Tell me." "The test wasn't about the money." He put on his coat. "Money was just the vehicle. The test was whether you could lose something important and not let it make you hard. Whether you could walk out of that conference room without bitterness and still have enough of yourself left to build with." He pulled up his collar. "A lot of people can't do that. They leave something like that and they spend the next 10 years carrying the weight of it. You didn't." Vivian looked at him. I wasn't perfectly okay, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know, perfectly okay isn't the point. The point is, you kept going and you kept being yourself while you did it. He shook her hand formally, and then, surprising them both slightly, pulled her into a brief hug that had 11 years of custodianship in it. Take care of it. I will. He left. The party continued another hour. Adrian stood in the kitchen talking to Camille, who had decided she liked him properly now, rather than just tentatively. And their conversation had the sound of two people who were both interested in the same person and finding common ground about it. Danny, the program coordinator who had spent 8 months sitting on opinions before Vivian gave her a table to put them on, was explaining something to a Continuum board member with the animated hands that were becoming her trademark. Richard Aldrin stood near the bookshelf reading the spines of Vivian's books, with the interested expression of a man who believed you could know a lot about a person from what they chose to keep. Vivian moved through the room. She refilled drinks and accepted a compliment about the food and had a real conversation with 2 people and a quick one with 4 others and stood for a moment near the kitchen doorway, watching the room the way you watch a room when you understand it belongs to you. Not possessively, not triumphantly. Just with the clean, undefended recognition that this is where you are and this is what you have and you built it, slowly and without a plan, by continuing to be yourself in the direction of the things that mattered. She had been asked once by a journalist who was profiling the Continuum for a sector publication whether she felt her story was about resilience, whether the divorce, the inheritance, the public reemergence, whether that arc was what she wanted people to take from it. She had thought about it for a moment before answering, because she had learned to take a moment before answering. I don't think it's a story about resilience, she had said. Resilience implies you were broken and recovered. I wasn't broken. I was erased, gradually, by a set of circumstances I participated in, and then I stopped participating. A pause. I think it's a story about what happens when you stop performing a version of yourself that doesn't fit and start making room for the version that does, which sounds simple and is actually very hard and takes longer than you'd expect. The journalist had written it down. Whether the piece would use it or cut it for something more compact and narratable, she didn't know. It didn't matter especially. What mattered was that it was true, that she could say it and mean it without performance, that she was standing in her own life, in the Carroll Gardens apartment with the good kitchen and the backyard and the surviving plants and the room full of people she had actually chosen. And the truth of her situation required no arrangement to be presentable. She was 39 years old. She chaired an organization that did real work in the world. She loved a man who handed her dishes and said the ordinary things on ordinary evenings. She had a plant she'd kept alive through 2 moves. She had a document box with a 2-page letter in it from a man who had needed too long to understand her and had finally said so. She had a grandmother she had never fully known who had watched her anyway and built something remarkable and left it waiting. She was not at the end of anything. She was in the middle of something that had no clean ending to reach for, which was not a problem. That was just what a life was, when you were living it honestly. Not a story with a resolution, but a continuous process of deciding who you were and acting accordingly, and adjusting when you were wrong and continuing. She would continue. She went back to the kitchen to get more wine for the table, and Adrian passed her in the doorway and put a hand briefly on the small of her back, and the party went on around her in all its ordinary warmth, and that was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.